I arrived in Greyhaven because the ocean there felt closer to me than any person ever had. The town was small enough to miss if you blinked while passing it on the coastal road, a loose scattering of weather-beaten houses, a narrow boardwalk, and a harbour that always smelled faintly of rusted metal and drying seaweed. The summer of 2016 carried a kind of fragile optimism for me. I had just turned 33 and still believed that distance and salt air could soften the harder edges of my life. I rented a tiny cabin from an old fisherman who barely spoke, a place with peeling white paint and windows that rattled whenever the tide shifted. It suited me. I wanted mornings filled with surf and evenings filled with the quiet clatter of my keyboard as I typed out work that felt more like obligation than purpose. That particular morning, I stepped onto the beach long before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Greyhaven was still half asleep, its single street silent and its porch lights extinguished. The air carried a strange weight to it, the kind of silence that didn't simply mean absence of sound, but a retreat of something larger. Even the gulls that normally screamed for scraps seemed to be waiting for something before taking flight. The ocean stretched out in front of me like a sheet of glass, unnervingly smooth except for a series of tiny ripples that appeared and vanished without forming foam. They didn't behave like normal waves. They rose and folded inward on themselves, as if collapsing into a depth that shouldn't have existed so close to shore. When I stepped into the shallows, the water gripped my ankles with an unexpected coldness, far sharper than the usual morning chill. It felt as though something brushed past me. Not a current, not seaweed, but a thread of cold that moved with intent. I stood there for a long moment, letting the sensation fade, telling myself it was only the early tide shifting under my feet. The sun lifted a little higher, colouring the surface with pale gold, but the ocean didn't brighten with it. Something in it remained muted, as if the light barely reached beneath the first few inches of water. I remember thinking the sea seemed deeper that morning, not in a literal sense, but in a way that made my chest tighten. It felt like I was standing at the edge of a threshold, one I hadn't noticed until I was already stepping over it. I didn't know then that what I felt wasn't the tide at all. I didn't know that something had already risen close enough to touch me, testing the boundary between its world and mine. Jack's fishing boat left the harbour just after sunrise. Between the small waves rolling toward us, bands of dull, matte water formed and stretched across the surface like ribbons. They didn't shimmer or catch the light the way normal currents did. Instead, they absorbed it, leaving long muted streaks that drifted outward and then split apart, only to reassemble in strange shapes. Some of them coiled into imperfect circles before dissolving again. A faint glow radiated from within the ribbons, not bright enough to be called light, more like the suggestion of it, barely perceptible in the morning haze. Jack's hand tightened around the wheel, knuckles rising pale against the wood, and he fixed his gaze on a distant point in the water. It wasn't a look of panic. It was quieter and far more unsettling, the expression of someone who had spent his life reading the ocean and now recognized something that didn't belong to it. By late afternoon, word had moved through Greyhaven in the way small-town speculation always did. Fishermen spoke about strange discolorations on their catches, thin coats of bluish-white residue that clung to the scales like frost. Others claimed that clams and mussels were shedding their shells in shallow tide pools, leaving exposed bodies that looked half dissolved. 3 days later, a local boy vanished while swimming at low tide. His empty chair stood half buried in the sand when I arrived, tilted slightly as if someone had left in a hurry. Near the spot where he had disappeared, the surface of the water looked subtly distorted, As I stepped closer, I saw a web of nearly invisible threads suspended just below the surface, impossibly thin, finer than fishing line, closer to the strands of a spider's web than anything marine. They hung in loose arcs that moved without any current to motivate them, and each thread glinted faintly when the sunlight hit it. The shimmer reminded me of the way crushed fireflies glow when smeared across skin or leaves, pale, sickly, and strangely warm in tone. I crouched down, held my hand above them, and felt an immediate drop in temperature. The air tightened around my wrist, and a crawling sensation prickled across my skin. I withdrew instinctively, but the impression lingered. The threads shifted in unison as though they were part of a single organism responding to my presence. They didn't drift with the tide or break apart. They contracted, stretched, and curved with deliberate precision, like something adjusting its posture to observe more clearly. That afternoon, rumors spread through town with unsettling speed. People claimed that at night, especially near the coves, they heard a faint whispering that drifted over the shallows long after the wind had died. It wasn't a voice, at least not one shaped by a mouth or lungs. It was more like a vibration, an overlapping series of soft rhythmic pulses that carried just enough tone to suggest intention. The boy had not simply drowned or drifted out to sea. He had been taken by something we had not yet learned to name. By the end of the month, 3 people had vanished. The official reports framed each disappearance as a tragic accident, but no one truly believed that anymore. Windows that once stayed open late into the humid evenings now slid shut as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Fishermen carried their catches under tarps, hiding the pale film accumulating on the crates. I became obsessed. I filled notebooks with hand-drawn maps of the shoreline, marking where each glowing ribbon had surfaced and at what time of day the patterns shifted. But the more I documented, the clearer it became that this was not tied to any natural cycle. The worst part was watching the threads weave themselves into geometric shapes too deliberate to be the product of waves or wind. In the center of each pattern appeared a dark spot, a circular void where the water trembled without breaking. These spots seemed to function like pupils, contracting when observed and fading entirely if stared at too long. Yet by nightfall, they always returned, stretching outward like fingers, searching for something on shore. One evening, Jack and I took his boat out farther than usual. The ocean around us was eerily calm. We killed the engine and let the boat drift in silence, watching as the threads collected fragments of seaweed, shells, and bits of driftwood. Slowly, methodically, they pulled the debris together and arranged it into shapes. What began as random clusters soon formed intricate structures, arches, columns, and small symmetrical towers. Then came the silhouettes, delicate outlines composed of interwoven filaments. They stood upright, their proportions unmistakably human, yet their forms were hollow, like sketches made of water and light. Some appeared to reach toward the surface, others seemed frozen mid-motion, their postures disturbingly familiar. I recognized the curve of a shoulder, the tilt of a head, the faint suggestion of someone bracing against a current. These forms were not abstractions. They were reconstructions, replicas of bodies that had once moved, breathed, and existed above the waterline. The threads had observed, studied, and recreated them with chilling accuracy, or they were preparing for the ones yet to come. I walked to the reef on a late afternoon when the tide was beginning to retreat. The threads descended into the darkness in long, delicate strands, arranged in rows that resembled a staircase built for something weightless. I stepped carefully onto the stone, leaning forward with my flashlight. When the beam settled on a cluster of threads near the drop-off, the strands recoiled in unison. They contracted sharply and then flattened into a dense mesh, as if bracing against an unseen force. Then a sound rose from the depths, a thin, piercing note that didn't seem to pass through the air so much as vibrate through the bone. It carried the brittle quality of a broken music box, grinding through its final rotation. My body reacted before my mind did. My muscles tightened and locked. It felt as though something had reached into the space just behind my thoughts and pressed its hands against the pathways that controlled movement. The threads touched something internal, invisible fingers flipping through the pages of my memory. Moments from my childhood surfaced unbidden. The smell of pine needles crushed underfoot, the sensation of rainwater dripping from my sleeves, my father's silhouette framed in the doorway. These memories didn't arrive gently. They were compressed into sharp fragments, each one tinged with a clarity that made them almost painful. The threads weren't simply reading them. They were extracting, sifting through them, evaluating what it meant to inhabit a body that lived and remembered. The water below flickered with fleeting colours. I recognised shapes and patterns from Jack's catches. The mottled greens of flounder, the bright silver of herring scales, the deep reds of lobster shells. But embedded within those shifting colours were memories that were not mine. Flashes of movement, pressure and sound. Sensations of fleeing, feeding and being hunted. The threads had collected memories from every creature they had touched, cataloguing each life with meticulous interest. The pressure in my mind grew heavier. I felt the edges of myself blur, as if I were being translated into something simpler, stripped down to essential components. It was not death in the physical sense, but an unraveling of definition. When the threads finally loosened and the sound dissipated, I stumbled backward. I left with the unsettling realization that the threads were not hunting in any traditional sense. They were learning, mapping the boundaries of what it meant to be alive, and reshaping those boundaries one stolen fragment at a time. The ending came without spectacle. The threads simply receded, withdrawing from the shoreline and slipping back into whatever depth had birthed them. Their departure carried no final gesture, no warning. It felt more like a pause than an ending, as though they had finished a task or reached the limit of their curiosity for the moment. Greyhaven tried to resume the motions of normal life, but small habits vanished in the people around me. An old man who spent every dawn staring at the horizon now kept his curtains closed. A family who had hosted picnics on the beach every summer packed their belongings and moved inland without a farewell. What remained was a town that carried the shape of Greyhaven, but none of its ease. I couldn't let it go. Sleep became a negotiation I rarely won. When I closed my eyes, I felt the reef again, the tightening pull on my memories, the internal unraveling. So I continued writing, recording every detail I could recall, as though anchoring myself to the page. Years passed, but the quiet hours before dawn never changed. In that thin space between night and morning, I sometimes heard the faint whirring note of that broken music box reverberating through my skull. There were dreams too, always vivid and always the same. I stood at the shoreline and watched as a damp handprint appeared on the surface of the water. A small glowing point hovered in the center of the palm, pulsating like a slow heartbeat. The handprint would linger until the glow beneath it brightened enough to suggest an eye opening. I always woke before it fully surfaced, but the recognition stayed with me. The threads were not gone. They were simply elsewhere, watching through whatever aperture connected their world to mine. The people who disappeared hadn't been lost or destroyed. They had been absorbed into something far older than our concept of death, woven into a system that didn't distinguish between memory and being. The ocean hadn't claimed them in the way humans claim territory. It had incorporated them, folding their existence into a vast, living tapestry that operated beyond our comprehension. I sometimes wondered if the ocean would rise again and lift that tapestry toward the surface, curious to see how we had changed in its absence. Whether it would recognize us as the same fragile creatures it had once studied, or whether we would be strangers, waiting unknowingly to be rewritten by the quiet intelligence that lived in the depths.